The gate bell rang 3 times before dawn, and that alone was wrong. Elena was already awake. She had not slept properly in 6 years, not really, not since the night she buried a name and took a smaller life in its place. She crossed the cold floor barefoot and looked through the shutter slit at the yard below. 4 horses stood steaming in the mist, men in dark coats, one rider taller than the rest, still, watching the house the way a man watches something he already owns. Her hand found the doorframe of the small room across the hall. Theo was sitting up in bed already, his dark hair flattened on one side, his eyes wide and awake in the way of children who have learned that quiet is safer than questions. "Stay here," Elena said. "Whatever you hear, stay here." He did not stay there. By the time she reached the yard, wrapping her shawl tight against a cold that had nothing to do with the weather, the tall rider had already dismounted. He removed his hat, and the mist seemed to move around him rather than through him, the way it moves around a stone that has always been part of the river. She knew him before she saw his face. She had buried this man. She had told the world, and told herself, and told the small boy asleep 2 rooms away, that this man did not exist anymore. "Elena," he said, just her name, nothing else. As if 6 years could be answered with 2 syllables. Behind her, small feet on the stone steps. A door she had not heard open. Theo stood in the doorway in his nightclothes, one hand gripping the frame, looking at the stranger the way he looked at storms building over the eastern hills. Not with fear exactly, with calculation. "Who is that?" Theo said. Not a question, a demand dressed as one. Elena did not answer. She could not find a sentence small enough to hold what needed to be said. The tall man, Duke Alaric Voss, a man the crown had declared dead in disgrace, and then, far too late, declared innocent and alive, looked at the boy in the doorway for a long moment. Something moved behind his eyes, something that had nothing to do with courts or titles or 6 years of stone walls. "Elena," he said again, quieter now, "who is the boy?" The wind picked up loose straw from the yard and carried it between them like something trying to fill a silence that had gone on far too long to be filled by wind alone. She could lie. She had built an entire life on the architecture of silence. One more lie, small and clean, and this man could ride away believing what he had always believed, that whatever they once had ended the day the soldiers came for him. But the boy was already looking between them, doing the arithmetic that 7-year-olds do faster than adults expect, matching a stranger's jaw to his own reflection in still water, matching a stranger's eyes to the ones that looked back at him from the small oval mirror in his mother's room. "Theo," Elena said, and her voice did not sound like her own voice. "Come here." He did not come. He stood in the doorway, hand still on the frame, and looked at Alaric Voss with the flat, unreadable stare of a boy deciding, right there in the cold morning air, exactly how much of his life he was willing to let this man take. "I asked you a question," Theo said to his mother, though his eyes never left the stranger. "Who is he?" Alaric took one step forward, just one. "I am your father," he said. The word landed, in the yard, like something dropped from a great height, and for a moment nobody moved. Not the horses, not the men behind him, not the mist curling low along the ground. Theo's face did not soften. It did not crumple the way a child's face is supposed to crumple in stories, into tears and running and small arms thrown around a returning parent's neck. Instead, something in him closed, quietly and completely, like a door that has learned exactly how to shut without a sound. "No," Theo said, "you're not." He turned and walked back into the house. Alaric stood in the yard, the word he had waited 6 years to say still hanging in the cold air, unclaimed. Elena watched her son disappear into the shadowed hallway and understood, with a certainty that settled into her bones like winter, that the war she had fought to protect him from had only just changed its shape. The soldiers were gone. The false charges were gone. The threats that had driven her into hiding were, by every official account, dead and buried with the men who made them. But the boy in the doorway had built a wall 6 years thick, one stone at a time, out of every night his mother told him his father was a hero who died before he was born. And heroes who die do not come back demanding to be called something they never earned the right to be called. "He looks like you," Alaric said finally, still staring at the empty doorway. His voice had lost the command it carried when he arrived. It sounded, for the first time in a long time, like the voice of a man rather than a title. "He looks exactly like you." "He looks like both of us," Elena said. "That's the problem." Alaric turned to face her fully now, and up close the 6 years showed on him too, in the gray threading his dark hair, in the new scar along his jaw, in the way he held himself like a man who had learned in a cell exactly how much silence a body could survive. "You told him I was dead." "I told him his father was gone before I could give him a name to hold on to. I told him it was safer that way." Elena's hands twisted the edge of her shawl. "Because it was. Alaric, they said if there was proof of a child, they would use him, against you, against the throne, against everyone who might have believed you were innocent. I did not hide him from you, I hid him from them. And now? Now they're gone. Now you're cleared. Now everything I built this life to protect against no longer exists." She let out a breath that shook more than she wanted it to. "And I have a son who has spent 6 years learning that the word father belongs to a ghost, not a man standing in his yard asking to be let in." Alaric looked past her, toward the house, toward the small closed door somewhere inside it. "Then I will have to earn the word," he said. "However long that takes." "You say that like it's simple." "I say it," Alaric said, "because it is the only thing I have left to offer him. I cannot give him 6 years back. I cannot give him a childhood where I taught him to ride, or held him when he was afraid of thunder. All I can give him now is time, starting today, and the truth, whenever he is ready to hear it." Elena studied his face for a long moment, looking for the man who had once made promises in a garden that no longer existed, promises about forever, and safety, and a life neither of them had been allowed to keep. "He will not make it easy," she said. "Good," Alaric said, and something almost like the ghost of a smile crossed his tired face. "I would not trust a son of mine who gave anything away easily." Inside the house, in the small room with the narrow bed, Theo sat with his knees pulled to his chest and listened to the murmur of voices in the yard below, too far away to make out words, close enough to know that his entire understanding of the world had just cracked down the middle like river ice in early spring. He had a father, not a hero in a story his mother told him at night, not a name carved into nothing, a memory built entirely out of his mother's careful, loving lies. A real man, standing in real mud, with real horses breathing steam into the cold morning air. A man who expected, apparently, to simply walk into the yard and be called something Theo had never once said out loud in his life. Theo pressed his forehead against his knees and made himself a promise, the kind of fierce, absolute promise that only children and the truly wounded know how to make. He would not call this stranger father, not tomorrow, not next week, maybe not ever. The man could have the yard, he could have the house, if it came to that, since everyone said it belonged to him by right of blood and title and law. He could have Elena's careful, complicated forgiveness, if she chose to give it. But the word itself, the one small word that Theo had guarded for 6 years like the last coin in an empty purse, that word was not going to be handed over simply because a stranger arrived on a fine horse and said it first. Downstairs, a door opened. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, crossed the hall. Theo lifted his head and watched his own door, waiting to see if the stranger would be foolish enough to come through it. The footsteps stopped just outside. "Theo," his mother's voice, gentle, careful, the voice she used when trying to coax a frightened animal from under a fence. "May we come in and talk to you?" Theo looked at the door for a long moment. "No," he said, "not yet." And on the other side of that door, Duke Alaric Voss, a man who had once commanded armies and endured a prison cell without breaking, found that a single closed door held more power over him than any wall he had ever faced. He did not force it open. He simply sat down on the floor of the hallway, his back against the wood, close enough that if the boy inside ever changed his mind, he would not have far to go to find him waiting. "I'll be here," Alaric said quietly, through the door, "for as long as it takes." Inside the room, Theo did not answer, but he did not tell the man to leave either. And for the first time since the gate bell rang 3 times before dawn, something in the house went, if not peaceful, then at least still. The stillness did not last. By mid-morning, word had already begun to travel the way word always travels in small villages, built too close to old secrets. A stable boy who recognized the Duke's crest on a saddle blanket. A baker's wife who had once, years ago, seen Lady Elena at court before she vanished entirely from every record that mattered. By noon, there were faces at the edge of the property, pretending to gather firewood, pretending to walk their dogs, all of them straining for a glimpse of the man who was supposed to be dead and the boy nobody had known existed. Elena stood at the window and watched the shapes gather at the tree line, like crows deciding whether a field was truly abandoned. "They'll talk," she said. "Let them," Alaric answered. He had not moved from the hallway floor for most of the morning, though eventually Theo's door had opened just enough for a small hand to push out a folded scrap of paper before shutting again. Alaric had unfolded it slowly, the way a man unfolds something he suspects might be dangerous. It read, in a child's careful, uneven letters, "You can stay in the yard, not the house." He had folded it back up and kept it, and something about the fact that he kept it, that he did not laugh it off or dismiss it as a child's tantrum, seemed to matter more than either of them said aloud. "They will not simply talk," Elena said now, still watching the tree line. "Alaric, the men who framed you were disgraced, not erased. Their families still hold land near the capital. Their allies still hold seats at court. The moment word reaches them that you are alive, restored, and standing in the doorway of a house with a son they never knew existed, they will not see a happy reunion. They will see a threat to whatever is left of their names." Alaric's jaw tightened. "Then we will be ready for them." "We were ready for them once," Elena said, turning from the window, and for the first time that day, her voice cracked slightly at the edges. "We were ready, and they still took 6 years from us. They took your name, they took my home, they took every single day Theo has spent not knowing his own father's face. I know. Do you? Because from where I'm standing, you rode in here as if the worst of it is already behind us. As if all that's left to do is win over a frightened boy, and everything goes back to how it was supposed to be." Alaric crossed the room, slowly, the way a man crosses towards something fragile. "Nothing is going to go back to how it was supposed to be," he said. "I know that, Elena. I have known it every single day I spent in that cell, staring at a ceiling and trying to remember the exact color of your eyes because I was afraid I would forget. I am not here to undo 6 years. I am here because I finally can be, and because a boy in that room deserves to know that his father did not choose to disappear. He was taken, and I am done letting other men decide what I am allowed to have." Elena studied him for a long moment, and whatever hard, guarded thing had lived behind her expression since the gate bell rang loosened. Just slightly, just enough to let something older and gentler show through. "He asked me this morning," she said quietly, "while you were still in the yard, whether you were the reason we always had to move, whether you were the reason we never stayed anywhere long enough to make friends." "What did you tell him?" "I told him the truth, that the men who hurt you were the reason, that you never chose any of it." She wrapped her arms around herself. "I don't know if he believed me. I don't know if 6 years of careful lies can simply be replaced by one morning of truth." "They can't," Alaric said. "Not in one morning. But maybe, eventually, in enough of them." Outside, the shapes at the tree line had grown by 2 more, and one of them, Elena noticed with a cold drop in her stomach, was mounted and wearing a coat too fine for a woodcutter or a curious neighbor. She did not say anything to Alaric yet. There would be time enough for fear later. For now, There was a boy behind a closed door who had, for the first time in his life, met his father and refused him, and somehow still left the door unlocked. The mounted man at the tree line did not approach that day, or the next, but by the third morning a letter arrived, carried by a rider in plain clothes who refused to give his name and left before anyone could question him. Alaric read it standing in the kitchen, Elena watching his face for whatever the words were doing to him. "It's from Cassian Vane," he said finally, folding the paper with the same careful precision he used for everything that mattered. "Son of the man who forged the letters that put me in that cell. What does he want? He offers congratulations on my return. He offers his father's condolences for the misunderstanding that cost me 6 years." Alaric's voice was flat, controlled, the voice of a man who had learned in prison exactly how dangerous an unguarded reaction could be. And he mentions, almost as an afterthought, how pleased the court will be to learn that the Duke has a son. An heir, a boy whose existence until 3 days ago was known to no one at all. Elena's hand went still against the table. "That's not congratulations. That's a warning. It's both." Alaric set the letter down. "He is telling us he knows. He is telling us that a boy who did not officially exist a week ago suddenly matters a great deal to the men who lost everything when my name was cleared. An heir changes the succession. An heir changes who inherits, who negotiates, who eventually sits where I sit. Cassian's family lost their standing when the truth came out. They will not sit quietly and watch a child undo whatever is left of their ambitions. So they threaten him. They imply. Vain men have never been foolish enough to threaten anything outright. They simply make sure you understand what could happen and let your own fear do the rest of the work." Alaric looked toward the hallway, toward the small closed door that had, over 3 days, begun to open a little wider each morning, though never wide enough to let him fully inside. Which means we no longer have the luxury of slow mornings and folded notes under doors. Whatever time I hope to take, earning Theo's trust one small kindness at a time, we may not have as much of it as I wanted. Elena's face had gone pale, but her voice, when it came, was steady in the particular way of a woman who had spent 6 years learning that panic solved nothing. "Then we protect him, the way we always have. The way we always have kept him alive," Alaric said gently. "It also kept him from ever knowing his own father. I do not want to protect him into another 6 years of silence, Elena. I want to protect him and let him know me. Both things have to be possible, or none of this was worth surviving." That afternoon, for the first time since the gate bell rang, Theo opened the door all the way and stepped into the hallway on his own, not summoned, not coaxed, simply present, arms crossed, watching Alaric with the same careful, assessing stare he had used in the yard 3 mornings before. "Mother says men are watching the house," Theo said. It was not a question. Alaric considered lying, considered the easy comfort of telling a child that everything was fine, that grown-up troubles were not his to carry. He decided, in the space of that single breath, that 6 years of protective silence had already cost this boy enough. "Yes," Alaric said, "some men are unhappy that I came back. They were unhappy that I existed at all, once, and they are more unhappy now that they've learned about you." Theo's arms tightened across his narrow chest. "Because of the title. The one you keep saying belongs to you and would belong to me. Partly, mostly because men who did wrong things are always afraid of what happens when the truth catches up to them. You becoming known makes the truth a little more permanent, a little harder to bury again. So it's my fault they're watching us." "No," Alaric said, sharper than he intended, and then softer, correcting himself. "No, it is not your fault. It was never your fault that they hurt me, and it is not your fault now that they are frightened of what your existence means. You did nothing wrong simply by being born, Theo. Do you understand that?" Theo did not answer directly. He looked down the hallway toward the front door, toward the yard beyond it, toward the tree line where, even now, Elena stood watch with her arms folded and her eyes narrow. "If they come for us," Theo said quietly, "what will you do?" "Whatever it takes to make sure they do not reach you or your mother," Alaric said, and there was no performance in it, no grand speech built for effect. Just a fact, stated plainly, the way a man states the one truth he has never once doubted about himself. "I have already lost 6 years I cannot get back. I will not lose you as well." Something in Theo's expression shifted, not into warmth exactly, but into something adjacent to it. Recognition, perhaps. The first small crack in a wall built stone by careful stone. "I still don't have to call you anything," Theo said. "No," Alaric agreed. "You don't." "Good," Theo said, and turned to walk back toward his room, though he paused at the doorway and glanced back once, briefly, before disappearing inside. It was such a small thing, that glance, and yet Alaric found himself standing in the hallway for a long moment afterward, turning it over in his mind like a coin he was not yet certain was real. The days that followed took on a rhythm neither Elena nor Alaric had expected, equal parts vigilance and small, careful attempts at ordinary life. Alaric mended the fence along the eastern field, not because it needed a duke's hands to fix it, but because working with them gave Theo an excuse to watch from a safe distance without the pressure of conversation. He fixed the hinge on the barn door that had squeaked for years. He learned, slowly and by trial, which of Theo's silences meant "leave me alone," and which meant, in the boy's own unspoken language, "stay close, but do not speak yet." Elena, meanwhile, sent word through channels she had built over 6 years of careful survival. Old contacts who owed her favors, a retired soldier 2 villages over who had once served under Alaric and never believed the charges against him. She was not a woman who waited passively for danger to arrive. She built defenses the way she had built an entire hidden life, quietly, methodically, without ever showing the fear underneath. It was on the 6th evening, as the sun folded itself behind the western hills, and the kitchen filled with the smell of bread Elena had baked from habit rather than hunger, that Theo asked the question none of them had been ready for. "Were you ever going to tell me the truth?" he said, not looking at his mother, staring instead at the bread cooling on the table. "Or was I always going to find out because a stranger showed up at the gate?" Elena's hands stilled over the loaf. "Theo, you told me he was a hero. You told me he died protecting people he loved." Theo's voice was not raised, not angry in the way a child's anger usually sounds, loud and immediate. It was quieter than that, and somehow harder to bear for its quiet. "You made up a whole story, a whole person. And then a real one walked into our yard and you looked at him like you'd seen a ghost, and I realized the hero you told me about was never real at all, just a nicer version of the truth." "I told you a version that would let you sleep at night," Elena said, her own voice thick now, unsteady. "I told you a version that would not have you asking questions. Men with knives at their belts might one day answer for me. I was not trying to lie to you for the sake of lying. I was trying to keep you safe in the only way I knew how. By making my father dead. By making him safe," Elena said. "For both of you." Theo looked up then, and his eyes, so much like his father's, so much like his mother's, held something raw and unguarded that neither adult in the room had seen since the morning the gate bell rang. "I don't know how to be angry at both of you at the same time," Theo said. "I don't know how to be angry at you for lying and angry at him for leaving when none of it was really either of your fault." "You don't have to know how yet," Alaric said quietly, from where he stood near the doorway, having entered the kitchen only moments before, and stopped, unwilling to interrupt something that was not his to interrupt. "You are allowed to be confused. You are allowed to be angry without deciding exactly where to put it. That is not a failure, Theo. That is simply what it feels like to have your whole world rearranged in the space of a week." Theo wiped his face quickly with the back of his hand, embarrassed at the wetness there, and said nothing more that evening, though later, long after the house had gone dark and quiet, Elena passed his door and heard him talking softly to himself, or perhaps to no one, rehearsing a word under his breath the way a boy rehearses something he is not yet ready to say out loud to another person. She did not open the door to listen closer. She simply stood in the hallway a moment, her hand pressed briefly against the old wood, and let her son have whatever private battle he was fighting in the dark. 3 days later, the watchers at the tree line vanished overnight, and for a single, dangerous morning, the household allowed itself to believe the danger had simply lost interest and moved on. They were wrong, and the price of that wrongness arrived before the week was out. The retired soldier Elena had once trusted with her life arrived at dawn on the 7th day, his horse lathered from riding through the night, his face carrying news before his mouth ever formed the words. His name was Garrick Holt, a broad, quiet man with a scar along one eyebrow that Alaric remembered from another lifetime, from a battlefield neither of them spoke of easily anymore. He swung down from his horse in the yard, and Elena was already at the door before his boots hit the ground. "They know where you are," Garrick said without preamble, because there was no gentle way to say what needed saying. "Cassian Vane's men rode through the lower village yesterday, asking questions about a widow and a boy who matched descriptions no one should have had reason to give. Someone talked. Maybe the baker's wife, maybe a stable hand who wanted coin more than loyalty. It does not matter who. What matters is they know, and they are not far behind me." Alaric's jaw tightened. The same controlled stillness he wore in the moment he first learned his own name had been cleared, a stillness that hid, rather than absent, the storm underneath. "How many men?" he said. "6, perhaps 8. Not soldiers in uniform. Vane is smart enough not to send anything that could be traced back to his family officially. These are men paid in silence, the kind who disappear afterward and take the truth with them." "Then we move," Elena said immediately, already turning toward the house, toward the small room where Theo still slept, unaware that the quiet mornings, mending fences and baking bread were about to end. "Move where?" Garrick asked. "You have already run once, Elena. Running again buys you time, not safety. Sooner or later they will find you, because the men chasing you have more resources and more patience than a widow and a boy hiding in a cottage." "Then what would you have us do?" Alaric said. "Stand here and wait for them to arrive? I would have you stop running and start fighting on ground you choose instead of ground they choose for you," Garrick said. "You are not the disgraced man they framed 6 years ago. You are a clear duke with a name the crown itself restored. Use it. Send word to the capital. Let it be known publicly, loudly, undeniably, that Cassian Vane's men are harassing the family of a man the crown has already declared innocent. Men who operate in shadows lose their nerve the moment enough light falls on them." Elena hesitated at the doorway, her hand on the frame, torn between the old instinct to flee and the new, uncertain hope that perhaps, this time, they did not have to. Inside the small room, Theo had been awake for some time, listening through the thin wall to every word, understanding perhaps more of it than any of the adults realized. He dressed quickly and quietly, then stood at his door for a long moment before finally stepping out into the hallway. "I heard," he said, before anyone could ask. "You're saying men are coming? Bad men?" Elena crossed the room to him immediately, kneeling to bring herself level with his eyes, an old habit from years of trying to explain frightening things in ways a small child could carry without breaking. "Yes, but we are not going to let anything happen to you. That has never once changed, not for a single day of your entire life." "I know," Theo said, and something in his voice had shifted since the morning by the gate, something steadier, something that had begun, slowly, cautiously, to include the tall stranger standing near the window in its accounting of who might keep him safe. "You always kept me safe, even when I didn't know why we moved so much, or why we never stayed anywhere long enough to make real friends. You were always doing it for this, for today." Elena's eyes filled, and she did not try to hide it. "Yes, I was." Theo looked past her, toward Alaric, and for the first time, there was something other than suspicion in the look, something closer to a question waiting to be asked. "What are you going to do?" Theo said to him directly. Alaric crossed the room slowly, crouching as Elena had, so that neither adult towered over the boy, the way authority so often did without meaning to. I am going to send word to people who owe me the truth after 6 years of silence. I am going to make certain the men chasing your mother understand that they are not chasing a widow anymore. They are chasing the family of a duke the crown has already restored, and if anything happens to either of you, there will be nowhere in this kingdom quiet enough for them to hide. And if that doesn't stop them, Alaric's expression did not soften, but something in it steadied, the calm of a man who had already decided, long before this moment, exactly how far he was willing to go. Then I will stop them myself, whatever that requires. Theo studied him for a long, quiet moment, weighing the words the way he had weighed everything since the morning the gate bell rang, searching for the seam where a performance might show through the fabric of a promise. He found none. "Okay," Theo said finally, and it was such a small word, and yet it carried more trust in it than anything he had offered in the 6 days since Alaric arrived. Garrick rode for the capital within the hour, carrying letters Alaric wrote quickly at the kitchen table, addressed to men who had once served alongside him, men who now held positions of influence and, more importantly, owed him debts from a war fought before any of this began. Elena spent the morning moving through the house with quiet, practiced efficiency, gathering what mattered most, preparing for the possibility that speed might yet be their only defense. It was during this hurried, tense morning that the past finally surfaced in full, not as a story told gently at bedtime, but as a truth Elena finally allowed herself to speak aloud, to Alaric, in full, for the first time since his return. They stood in the small kitchen, Theo occupied outside with feeding the chickens, a task Elena had given him partly to keep him useful and partly to give the adults room to speak without small ears listening at doorways. "I need you to understand why I did what I did," Elena said, her hands wrapped tightly around a cup of tea gone cold and forgotten. "Not to excuse it. I know 6 years is not a debt easily forgiven, but you deserve the whole truth, not the pieces I have given you since you arrived." "I'm listening," Alaric said. "When they took you," Elena began, and her voice trembled slightly at the memory, "I was already carrying Theo, though I did not know it yet, not for several more weeks. By the time I understood, the trial had already begun, and it was clear from the first week that the outcome had been decided long before any evidence was heard. Cassian's father had forged enough letters, bribed enough witnesses, that your conviction was never truly in question. I watched them build a case out of lies so convincing that even people who loved you began to doubt. I remember," Alaric said quietly. "I remember watching your face in the gallery the day they read the sentence. I remember thinking I would never see it again. I almost came to you afterward. I almost told the guards, told anyone who would listen, that I was carrying your child, thinking perhaps mercy might be found where justice had failed." Elena's hands tightened around the cup. "And then one of Vane's men found me before I could act, a quiet, polite man who visited under the pretense of offering condolences, and told me, very gently, very calmly, that if it ever became known publicly that you had an heir, that child would become a piece on a board, far larger and far more dangerous than anything I could protect against. He did not threaten directly. Men like that never do. He simply described, in careful detail, exactly how convenient it would be for certain people if an unborn heir simply never survived to be born." Alaric's face went very still, the particular stillness of a man forcing himself not to break something with his bare hands. "So I disappeared," Elena continued. "I told everyone who might have known me that I had died of grief, or fled the country, or any story that would end the questions. I built a new name, a new life, in a village far enough from the capital that no one thought to look twice at a quiet widow raising her son alone. I told Theo his father died a hero, because the truth, that his father was in a prison cell for a crime he never committed, while his mother hid in terror of men who might kill an infant to protect a lie, was not a truth a child could carry and still learn to feel safe in the world. You protected him the only way you could," Alaric said, and his voice, when it came, held none of the accusation Elena had braced herself to hear. I do not fault you for that, Elena. I have had 6 years in a cell to imagine every possible reason you might have vanished, and every version I built in my mind was crueler to you than the truth turned out to be. You did not abandon me, you saved our son. I let you believe you had no child at all. You let me believe a lie that kept him alive, Alaric said. I would make that same trade, every single time, if the alternative was losing him before he ever drew breath. Elena set the cup down, finally, her hands trembling now that the whole truth had been spoken aloud and could not be taken back. I am telling you this now because I need you to understand that everything I have done, every lie, every disappearance, every night I told Theo a story instead of the truth, was built entirely around keeping him safe from exactly the kind of men who are riding toward this house right now. I know how to disappear, Alaric. I do not yet know how to stand and fight, not the way you seem to believe we can. Then we will learn together, Alaric said, because I am done disappearing, and I refuse to let you or Theo pay the price of hiding for a crime that was never yours to answer for. Outside, in the yard, Theo scattered feed for the chickens with more force than the task required, working through something in himself that had nothing to do with hungry birds and everything to do with a conversation he had partially overheard through the thin kitchen window, words like disappear and air and kill an infant to protect a lie landing in him with a weight no 7-year-old should have to carry. He had always believed the man in that story was invented entirely, a comfort built from nothing. Now he understood the man in the story was real, had simply been alive the entire time, locked away for a lie, while his mother carried a truth so dangerous she had been forced to erase herself and her unborn son from the world simply to survive it. It changed something in Theo, standing there in the cold with empty feed scattered around his boots. It did not erase 6 years of believing his father was dead. It did not undo the anger, still sharp and unresolved, at having been lied to for the whole of his short life. But it planted something new alongside the anger, something that had not been there before, a grudging, uncertain understanding that perhaps the man in the yard, the man who mended fences and fixed hinges and knelt to speak to him at eye level instead of towering above him, had not chosen any of the 6 years he lost either. Theo walked back toward the house slowly, turning the thought over the way he turned over interesting stones found along the riverbank, unwilling yet to say anything aloud, but no longer entirely certain the wall he had built was worth defending quite so fiercely. By mid-afternoon, Garrick had not yet returned, and the road toward the village remained empty in the pale autumn light, though Elena's instincts, honed by 6 years of watching for exactly this kind of stillness before a storm, told her the quiet would not hold much longer. She was right. Just before dusk, a rider appeared at the edge of the property, alone, unhurried, dressed in the same fine, understated coat the mounted man at the tree line had worn days before. He did not approach the gate. He simply stopped at the edge of the road, removed his hat, in a gesture that mimicked courtesy, without containing any of its warmth, and waited. Alaric stepped into the yard alone, leaving Elena and Theo inside, though he could feel both of them watching from the window, could feel the particular tension of a boy who had, only hours before, begun to understand exactly what kind of danger his existence represented to men who preferred the world to remain exactly as convenient as it had been before his father returned. Duke Voss, the rider called, his voice carrying easily across the still evening air. Cassian sends his regards. He wished me to relay a simple message. Then relay it, Alaric said, and go. He says the Crown's mercy toward you does not extend indefinitely toward every complication your return might create. He says a man who values quiet is willing to remain quiet indefinitely, so long as certain inconvenient truths remain equally quiet in return. Meaning my son. Meaning, the rider said, with the careful, practiced calm of a man delivering a threat dressed as diplomacy, that some truths are better left buried, for everyone's sake, including the boys. Alaric's voice, when it came, was low and absolutely without warmth. Tell Cassian Vane that I spent 6 years buried, for a crime his father invented out of nothing, and I have no intention of allowing my son to inherit that same grave. Tell him the Crown already knows my son exists. Tell him that letters are already on their way to men who will ensure that any harm that comes to my family will be answered publicly, decisively, and without mercy. Tell him quiet only works when both sides agree to it, and I no longer agree to anything that requires my family's silence." The writer studied him for a long moment, something flickering behind his eyes that might have been surprise, or perhaps simple recalculation. "I will relay the message," he said finally, and turned his horse without another word, riding back the way he had come, disappearing into the deepening blue of early evening. Alaric stood alone in the yard for a long while after the hoofbeats faded, watching the empty road, knowing with absolute certainty that the message he had sent back would not end this quietly, and that whatever came next would arrive not as a polite rider with a careful warning, but as something far more direct. Behind him, the front door opened, and small footsteps crossed the yard until Theo stood beside him, closer than he had stood since the morning the gate bell first rang. "Was that one of them?" Theo asked, watching the empty road with the same wary focus his father wore. "Yes." "What did he want?" "To frighten us into silence," Alaric said. It did not work. Theo was quiet for a long moment, studying the darkening horizon where the rider had disappeared. "My mother said you would stop them, whatever it takes. I meant it." "I believe you," Theo said, and though he did not reach for Alaric's hand, though he did not soften into the easy affection storybooks promised between fathers and sons, he stood beside him in the cooling evening air, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, and did not step away. It was not the word Alaric had waited 6 years to hear, but standing there, in the fading light, with his son beside him instead of behind a closed door, it felt, for the first time since his return, like something close enough to hope to hold on to. Garrick returned 2 days later, exhausted from the road, but carrying news that put color back into Elena's face for the first time since the writer's visit. The letters had reached the capital. Men who owed Alaric old debts of loyalty had already begun asking questions in the right circles, questions about Cassian Vane's continued influence, questions about why a family the Crown had already restored was being harassed by men connected to a name already stained by forgery and false testimony. "It will not stop him overnight," Garrick warned, seated at the kitchen table with a cup of something warm wrapped in both hands. "Men like Vane do not simply give up because the tide has turned against them. If anything, cornered men become more dangerous, not less, because they have less left to lose." "How much time do we have?" Elena asked. "Days, perhaps a week, before enough pressure builds at court that Vane either backs away entirely or does something reckless enough to make his father's old crimes look modest by comparison." Garrick's eyes moved toward the window, toward Theo, who sat near the hearth pretending to mend a length of rope while clearly listening to every word. "I would not leave this house undefended in the meantime." That night, after Theo had finally gone to bed, though sleep did not come easily to any of them anymore, Alaric stood watch at the window while Elena moved quietly through the house, checking locks that had never before needed checking, latches that had never before mattered. It was well past midnight when the first sound came, not loud, not obvious, simply wrong. The particular wrongness of a footstep where no footstep should be, out past the barn, where the fence Alaric had mended only days before ran along the edge of the property. Alaric was moving before he had fully processed the sound, some old instinct from a life before prison walls, rising up through 6 years of stillness, sharp and immediate. "Elena, wake Theo, now." She did not question him. 6 years of vigilance had taught her to trust the sound of danger the instant she heard it named. She was up the stairs before Alaric reached the door, Theo's name already on her lips. Outside, shapes moved along the tree line, 3, perhaps 4, spreading out with the deliberate, patient movement of men who had done this kind of work before and did not intend to be seen until they wished to be. Alaric did not wait for them to choose the moment. He stepped out into the yard, deliberately, visibly, placing himself between the house and the approaching shapes, his voice carrying flat and clear across the dark field. "I know you're there. I know who sent you. And I want you to understand, before you take one more step toward this house, that everything you do tonight is already being watched. Men from the capital are on their way here even now, sent to confirm the safety of a duke's family after your master's rider delivered his threats 2 days ago. If anything happens to us tonight, there will be no story you can build afterward that survives the questions that follow." For a long moment, nothing moved. The shapes at the tree line held their position, weighing the truth of the words against whatever orders they had been given. Then one of them stepped forward into the pale moonlight, a broad man with a coat too fine for honest work, and Alaric recognized, even in the dim light, the same careful, unhurried arrogance the rider had worn 2 days before. "Brave words," the man said, "for someone standing alone in an open yard." "I am not alone," Alaric said, though his voice did not waver. "But even if I were, I would still be standing between you and my family, and that is not a position I intend to abandon tonight or any other night." Inside the house, Elena had reached Theo's room, pulling him from sleep with a hand gentle but urgent on his shoulder. He woke instantly, some part of him already primed by 6 years of sudden moves and careful vigilance to understand, without needing to be told, that danger had finally arrived. "Stay low, stay quiet, and follow me," Elena whispered, and Theo did not argue, did not ask the dozen questions crowding behind his eyes. He simply moved, following his mother down the back stairs toward the small cellar door that had, until this moment, held nothing more dangerous than preserved vegetables and old furniture. But as they reached the bottom of the stairs, Theo stopped, his small hand gripping the frame of the cellar door, and looked back toward the front of the house, toward the yard, where he could hear, faintly, the low murmur of his father's voice carrying through the cold night air. "Theo, we need to go," Elena said. "He's out there alone. He knows what he's doing. He said he'd stop them. He said whatever it takes." Theo's voice cracked slightly, not with fear exactly, but with something more complicated, something that had been building in him since the morning by the gate, unresolved and unnamed until this very moment. "If something happens to him, because he was protecting us, and I never once—" He did not finish the sentence. He did not need to. Elena knelt in front of her son in the dim cellar light, understanding, with sudden and complete clarity, that whatever answer she gave in the next few seconds would matter to Theo for the rest of his life. "Stay here," she said. "I mean it. Do not come out until I come back for you, no matter what you hear." Theo nodded, though his eyes were wet, though every instinct in his small body was screaming at him to run toward the yard, instead of away from it. Elena moved back up the stairs and out into the night, positioning herself at the edge of the doorway where she could see the standoff unfolding in the yard, her hand closed tightly around the old hunting knife she had carried, hidden, for 6 years, without ever once needing it until tonight. In the yard, the broad man had taken another step closer, and Alaric had not moved, had not retreated a single pace, standing exactly where he had chosen to stand, between the house and the men who wanted access to it. "You cannot stop what is already in motion," the broad man said. "Vane's family has too much to lose. They will keep sending men until either your family disappears quietly or you do." "Then they will keep failing," Alaric said, "because I have already lost everything a man can lose, and I came back from it. There is nothing left you can threaten me with that frightens me more than the 6 years I already survived. But you should understand something clearly before you decide what happens next. If you touch my family, if you so much as frighten my son again, I will not wait for the crown's justice to find you. I will find you myself, and there will not be a court gentle enough to matter by the time I am finished." The broad man studied him for a long moment, and something in Alaric's stillness, the absolute, unshakable calm of a man who had truly meant every word, seemed finally to land. "This is not over," the man said, though his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. No, Alaric agreed. But it is over for tonight. Behind him, unseen in the shadows near the barn, another shape moved, one Alaric had not accounted for, closer than the others, close enough that by the time he registered the movement, the man was already lunging forward. Elena's voice cut across the yard, sharp and immediate. Alaric! He turned just in time, the warning giving him the half-second he needed to avoid the worst of the blow, though the man's shoulder caught him hard enough to send them both to the ground, grappling in the cold mud of the yard, while the broad man and his companions watched, uncertain now whether to intervene or retreat. It did not last long. Whatever skill 6 years of confinement had stolen from Alaric's body, it had not stolen the desperate, absolute clarity of a man fighting for something more important than his own safety. Within moments, the attacker was pinned, disarmed, and the broad man, seeing the balance of the night shift decisively away from his favor, called a sharp, low word to his remaining companions. They melted back into the tree line as quickly as they had appeared, leaving the attacker groaning in the mud, leaving Alaric on his knees in the cold yard, breathing hard, his hands scraped and shaking with the aftermath of adrenaline rather than fear. Elena reached him first, kneeling beside him, checking for injury with quick, practiced hands. "Are you hurt?" "No," Alaric said, though his voice was rough. "No, I'm fine." It was only then, in the sudden quiet that followed, that both of them heard the small footsteps crossing the yard, and turned to see Theo standing several paces away, having disobeyed every instruction given to him that night, his face pale in the moonlight, his eyes fixed on his father kneeling in the mud. "You said stay in the cellar," Elena said, though there was no real anger in it, only exhausted relief that the danger, for tonight at least, had passed. "I couldn't," Theo said, his voice unsteady. "I heard him say he'd find them himself. I heard the fighting. I thought—" He stopped, swallowing hard, and took a step closer, then another, until he was standing directly in front of Alaric, who was still kneeling in the cold mud, watching his son with an expression that held no expectation, no demand, simply quiet, patient hope. "You really would have," Theo said. "Fought for us, even after everything, even though I never once. I would fight for you 1,000 times over," Alaric said, "whether you ever call me anything at all. That was never the condition, Theo. I did not come back hoping to be repaid with a word. I came back because you are mine, whether you choose to claim that or not, and I will not stop protecting you simply because you are not yet ready to let me all the way in." Theo's face crumpled. Finally, the wall that had held for 6 years, and then for 6 more days beginning, at last, to show real and undeniable cracks. He did not say the word. But he stepped forward, closing the last small distance between them, and pressed himself against his father's chest in the cold, muddy yard, and Alaric wrapped his arms around him without hesitation, holding his son for the first time since before he was born, while Elena stood watching, her own tears finally falling freely in the moonlight, the fear of 6 years beginning, at long last, to loosen its grip. They stayed that way for a long moment, none of them speaking, the aftermath of danger settling slowly into something quieter, something that felt, for the first time since the gate bell rang, less like survival and more like the fragile, uncertain beginning of an actual family. "We should go inside," Elena said eventually, her voice thick. "It's cold, and Garrick will need to know what happened." Theo pulled back slightly, though he did not fully release his hold on his father's coat, small fingers still gripping the fabric, as if reluctant to test whether the closeness would still be there once they stood up. "Will they come back?" Theo asked. "Perhaps," Alaric said honestly, because he had promised himself, somewhere in that cold yard, that he would not build this fragile new trust on convenient lies. "But not tonight. And when they do, we will be ready, together, the way a family is supposed to be ready for anything that comes for it." Theo nodded slowly, and for the first time, the silence between them did not feel like distance. It felt, instead, like the quiet before something finally, carefully, beginning to heal. The men from the capital arrived 3 days later, a small but formal delegation sent at the request of officials who had received Alaric's letters and taken them seriously enough to act. They came not with soldiers, but with lawyers, investigators, and a quiet, careful thoroughness that Cassian Vane's family had clearly not anticipated. Garrick met them at the gate and brought them inside, and for the better part of 2 days the house that had spent a week under threat became instead a place of statements taken, evidence reviewed, and old wounds finally examined in the full light of official scrutiny. It turned out Cassian had been careless in ways his father never was. The rider who delivered his warning had been recognized by one of the capital's own investigators, a man who had crossed paths with Vane's household before, and recorded, discreetly, enough detail to connect the threats directly back to Cassian himself. Combined with the attack in the yard, an attack witnessed and testified to by Elena, by Alaric, and even by Garrick, who had arrived just in time to see the aftermath, the case against Cassian Vane assembled itself with a speed that surprised even the investigators sent to build it. He miscalculated, one of the officials explained to Alaric on the second evening, the two of them standing in the yard where, only days before, a very different kind of confrontation had taken place. He believed a duke recently returned from disgrace would be too cautious to draw attention to himself, too grateful simply to have his name restored to risk drawing the crown's eye a second time. He did not account for a man willing to risk everything, publicly and immediately, to protect a family he had only just found. "I had already lost enough time being cautious," Alaric said. "I was not going to lose any more of it." By the end of the week, formal charges had been brought against Cassian Vane, charges serious enough that even his family's remaining influence could not fully shield him from consequence. It would not be resolved overnight. Official matters rarely were. But the immediate danger, the men who might have come again in darker numbers, evaporated the moment it became clear that harming Alaric's family would cost far more than any advantage it might have gained. For the first time in longer than either of them could easily remember, Elena and Alaric found themselves with nothing urgent to fear, no watchers at the tree line, no letters carrying careful threats disguised as courtesy, only the strange, unfamiliar quiet of an ordinary evening, the kind neither of them had been permitted in years. They sat together on the porch steps after Theo had gone to bed, the autumn air cool but no longer carrying the particular chill of danger, and for a long while neither of them spoke, simply sitting side by side in the dark, listening to the ordinary sounds of a night with nothing left to hide from. "I owe you an apology," Alaric said eventually, "that I have not yet properly given." "For what?" "For arriving the way I did. Riding into your yard before dawn with soldiers at my back, expecting, somewhere in the part of me that had spent 6 years imagining this exact moment, that you would simply fall into my arms and everything broken between us would mend itself instantly." He shook his head slowly. "I was thinking only of what I had lost, not of what you had built to survive losing me. I am sorry for that." Elena was quiet for a moment, watching the dark line of the tree line where danger had once gathered and now held nothing but ordinary night. "I spent 6 years telling myself that if you ever came back, I would not let you in easily," she said. "Not because I stopped loving you, but because loving you the first time cost me everything, and I did not think I could survive losing it all a second time." She turned to look at him. "But you did not come back the way I feared you would, demanding I simply forget everything I built to protect Theo. You earned your way back in, slowly, patiently, even when he refused you outright. That mattered more than I think you realize." "I did not know how else to do it," Alaric admitted. "I only knew that demanding would fail, and walking away was never something I was willing to consider." Elena reached over in the darkness and found his hand, and for a long moment neither of them said anything more, simply sitting together in the quiet the way they once had, years ago, before soldiers and false charges and 6 years of separation had rewritten the shape of both their lives. "I think," Elena said finally, "we are going to be all right." "I think so too," Alaric said, and for the first time since his return, he allowed himself to believe it completely. The weeks that followed unfolded slowly, the way healing usually does, not in single dramatic moments, but in small, accumulated ordinariness. Alaric taught Theo to ride, the two of them spending long afternoons in the eastern field, Theo's initial stiffness slowly loosening into genuine laughter as he learned to sit a horse properly. Elena watched from the porch some days, and on others joined them, the three of them moving through the golden autumn light like a family, finally given permission to simply exist without fear. Theo still did not call him father, not in those early weeks, though the distance between them had softened into something closer to friendship, an easy companionship built on shared afternoons and small, ordinary trust. He called him by his given name sometimes, quietly, testingly, as if trying the word out to see how it fit. Alaric never pushed for more than that. He had learned, in the months since his return, that some things could not be rushed, only earned, one patient day at a time. It was on a cold morning nearly 2 months after the gate bell first rang that everything finally settled into place, not through any grand gesture or planned occasion, but through something small and unplanned, the way most true things arrive. Theo had gone out early to check on the horses, and Alaric found him standing at the fence, watching the mist rise off the field the way he had watched it that very first morning, though everything about the moment now felt different, gentler, free of the fear that had once colored every glance between them. "Couldn't sleep?" Alaric asked, coming to stand beside him at the fence. "I kept thinking about something," Theo said, not looking away from the field. "About what you said, that night in the yard, that you'd fight for me, whether I ever called you anything or not." "I meant it." "I know," Theo said. "That's why I kept thinking about it." He was quiet for a moment, his small hands gripping the top rail of the fence. "I used to think, if I never said it, it would mean you hadn't really won. Like the word was the last thing I had control over, and if I gave it away, there'd be nothing left of the wall I built." Alaric said nothing, simply waited, understanding that this was not a moment to be hurried. "But I don't think that's true anymore," Theo continued. "I think the wall was never really about keeping you out. I think it was about protecting myself from being disappointed again, the way I was disappointed every time we had to move, every time I thought maybe this place would finally be home and it wasn't." He finally turned to look at Alaric directly, his young face open in a way it had not been since before the gate bell rang. "You didn't disappoint me. Not once, not even when it would have been easier for you to just be a duke and let someone else handle all of it. You are the easiest thing I have ever fought for," Alaric said quietly. "There was never a version of this where I considered letting someone else carry it." Theo looked back out over the misty field for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice was steady, certain, free of hesitation for what felt like the first time. "I think I'm ready," he said, "to call you what you actually are." Alaric's breath caught, though he did not push, did not fill the silence with anything that might rush the moment past its natural pace. Theo turned to face him fully, and in the pale morning light, with mist curling low over the field exactly as it had the first day they met, he said the word he had guarded so fiercely for 2 months, the word that had once felt like the last coin in an empty purse, spent freely now, without regret. "Father." It was such a small word, and yet it landed in Alaric with the weight of everything he had lost and fought to reclaim. 6 years of silence and grief and stubborn, unbroken hope finally arriving at the one destination that had made all of it worth surviving. He knelt in the wet grass, bringing himself level with his son, and did not trust his voice enough to speak right away. "Say it again," Alaric said finally, his voice rough. Theo smiled, the first truly unguarded smile Alaric had seen from him since his return, and stepped forward into his arms. "Father," he said again, softer this time, no longer testing the word but simply living inside it. Elena found them there minutes later, kneeling together in the misty field, and understood immediately, from the way Alaric held their son, from the way Theo's small arms wrapped fully around his father's neck for the first time in his life, exactly what had finally happened. She did not interrupt. She simply stood at the fence, watching the two people she loved most in the world finally find their way to each other completely, and allowed herself, for the first time in 6 long years, to feel entirely and unguardedly happy. That evening, the three of them sat together at the kitchen table, no letters to write, no watchers to fear, no wall left standing between any of them. Theo talked easily now, asking Alaric questions about the years he had missed, about battles fought long before he was born, about the prison cell his father had endured and somehow survived with his hope intact. "How did you not give up?" Theo asked. "In all that time, not knowing if you'd ever see either of us again." Alaric considered the question carefully, the way he considered everything that mattered. "Because somewhere in that cell," he said, "even without knowing you existed, I believed your mother was still out there, and that belief alone was enough to keep me going. When I finally learned about you, it simply gave that hope a name and a face I had not yet had the honor of knowing." He reached across the table and rested his hand briefly over Theo's smaller one. "You were the reason I fought so hard to survive, long before I even knew to fight for you specifically. Some things I think we carry inside us, before we ever fully understand why." Theo smiled at that, a real smile, unguarded and warm, and Elena watched the two of them from across the table, thinking of the long, frightened years she had spent believing this exact moment might never be possible. Outside, the autumn evening settled quietly over the house, no shapes gathering at the tree line, no threats waiting in the mist, only a family, finally whole, sitting together at a table that had once held only fear and silence, now filled instead with the easy, ordinary warmth of people who had fought hard enough and waited long enough to finally come home to each other. The Duke had returned to reclaim his wife. He had found, instead, something far greater waiting for him in that quiet cottage, a son who had guarded his heart fiercely, and chosen, in his own time, on his own terms, to finally let his father all the way in. It was not the reunion Alaric had imagined riding through the gate that first cold morning. It was better, because it had been earned, one patient day at a time, by a man who understood that some words are worth more, precisely because they are never simply given. They are chosen.